you will see a little warning about that right now. So without further ado, our time here today is to welcome a presentation from my colleague, Professor Anthony Perl, who is a sustainable transportation expert with the Urban Studies program and also a professor of political science at Simon Fraser University. And we will be hearing from Anthony some of the findings of his multi-year study on transportation and urban development patterns information across Canada, in major cities across Canada, looking at the Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal urban regions in comparative perspective, that has been published in his 2020 book with McGill Queen's University Press called Big Moves, subtitled Global Agendas, Local Aspirations and Urban Mobility in Canada. And after the presentation, there will be time for questions and discussion. So looking forward to that. Anthony, I will pass the microphone over to you.
Thank you, Meg. Bonjour à tous. It's a pleasure to join today this Crossing Paths and Perspectives symposium, and to share with you some of my experience from the decade-long research project that sought to total up the balance of major mobility investment in Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. And it was a comparative effort, but today I'm going to focus primarily on the experience here in Vancouver, which inevitably connects in, as you'll see, with a pattern that we found even in the diversity of experiences across the country. So I think that one of the things that Canada has is a diversity of policies and practices at the local level, as well as an exposure to global forces and engagement between the global and the local that is less mediated than almost any other country of our size and economic development by national governments. Most nations have national ministries of urban affairs, as well as national transportation departments that occupy themselves with developing and financing and planning major urban transportation systems. For most of our history, Canada has not had that. And as a result, there is a lot less standardization in the development of our urban transportation in this country, which also opens us up to unique and episodic patterns of global-local dynamics that shape critical junctures, which is when big chunks of infrastructure, whether they're expressways or rapid transit, get built. And I'll be using the term major mobility development to mean high-speed, high-capacity urban mobility infrastructure. It's not streetcars, it's not buses, it's not bike lanes. It's expressways and metros of one sort or another. This type of infrastructure is typically long-lasting, and the political science part of the analysis in this book focused on a phenomenon known as policy path dependence, which suggests that institutionally and organizationally, there's also a durability toward making these big move investments in infrastructure. Once you build an expressway, there are social, economic, and political organizational impacts that last much longer than the infrastructure itself, even though major mobility infrastructure is long-lasting in and of itself. But for example, for our colleagues from Montreal, the Turcotte Expressway interchange did not last indefinitely. It started to fall apart, and yet the powers that be, the various local governments, provincial governments, and maybe even Ottawa might have chipped in, rebuilt it very much the way it was. That is an example of policy path dependence. that even after the infrastructure wears out, the political and organizational structures in place perpetuate it and leave a legacy, in some ways a problematic legacy, many ways, when it comes to urban expressways. Finally, the third major theme of the book's findings is that Canada is a place where we have ambivalent urbanism, we call it in the book. We are not quite as passionate about urbanism as some other places in the world. We can discuss what that means in other areas, perhaps, but in transportation, what it means is policy equivocation, where our local and provincial and sometimes national government, when they've gotten involved in building major mobility infrastructure in cities, tend to alternate or go back and forth between building expressways, which are very anti-urban pieces of mobility infrastructure, and metros and rapid transit, which usually are pro-urban in the sense that they concentrate and facilitate urban development. And this equivocation has been embedded into Canada's urban fabric in all three of our major cities over time. So this is a cute map that helps to illustrate something, I guess, that if you were to connect all the rapid transit infrastructure in Canada, our national map would look like this. We have Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. Yes, there's Calgary and Edmonton. They have light rail systems. Ottawa just opened a tramway also. But basically, when it comes to major mobility by public transport, this is what the map of Canada would look like. And they're different technologies, different operating systems, different amounts, and different amounts of coverage within the urban region. But maybe one of the things that might help explain why it took me a decade to write this book in final form is that partly because of the lack of a national agency or ministry that plans and manages all of this. Someone needs to mute themselves, please. Thank you. Because of our lack of a national ministry of urban development or transportation, there is no one place to go to find out how much did it cost to build the Montreal Metro or the TTC subway in Toronto or the SkyTrain in Vancouver. It took years, literally, of archival research in municipal, provincial, federal budgets, as well as other sources of capital, including private investments, to stitch that together. You could, in the time that we are having this seminar today, you could go online and find out this same level of information for every American city in the United States. How much did it cost to build their metro? How much did it cost to build their expressways? Because the federal government, the US Department of Transportation, has funded just about all of those projects one way or another. And one of their conditions for the funding is that the project's budgets be public and accessible in a common database that is easy to find. That is not the case in Canada. And it tells you something about our ambivalent urbanism, I think, that it had been at least 60 or 70 years since we've been spending quite a lot on the whole on this major mobility infrastructure in our cities. And no one had ever thought that it was important enough to add up the amounts and say, how much did we spend and what did we get for it? So we did it, at least through the 20th century. We stopped around 2002. So let's look at Vancouver here. This is a map from the book. The dark lines are expressways. The lighter ones are rapid transit. And you can see that there's still a lot of empty space that needs filling in if you believe that a city needs to have lots of major mobility infrastructure. Ours started first, believe it or not, in Canada. If you define the expressway part of major mobility infrastructure using the technical standards of the Transportation Association of Canada, which is the coordinating body for provincial departments of transportation that sets standards, guidelines and standards for technical activities involving infrastructure and operations in Canada. You go to the Transportation Association of Canada's specifications and find what is an expressway, because in other countries it is legally defined, for example, by the United States government. If a city like Burlington, Vermont, or Seattle is going to build an expressway and get a penny of federal subsidy or investment in it, they have to follow legal specifications on what that piece of infrastructure should contain and should not contain. That does not exist in the same way in Canada, but the Transportation Association of Canada defines expressways as limited access, no traffic lights, no curb cuts. There's a set of specifications. And if you go by that set of specifications, the very first urban expressway that was ever built on Turtle Island, anywhere in Canada, is here in Vancouver. We were the first. We built the first urban expressway in Canada, which does not exactly fit with Vancouver's myth of being the virgin expressway city in North America that did not have any expressways defiling the urban space. Like a lot of urban myths, there's some truth to it, but it is not exact or complete. And as you can see with the black lines here, at the very east end of the city, there is an expressway running to the Second Narrows Bridge and across to North Vancouver. And at the very west end of the city, there is an expressway, and that's the first one that was built in Canada, running from the west end of downtown through our cathedral of urban space, of urban sustainability, Stanley Park, across to the North Shore. What I hope to be able to show to you in the next few minutes is how Vancouver created this relationship between expressways and rapid transit infrastructure. And a key ingredient are the global city dynamics that I've already talked about, that being unconstrained by national and provincial policies, that allowed the global to influence the local more directly than anywhere else in a major city in the West, I would say. And in the 1930s, West Vancouver, that area on the North Shore toward the west of downtown Vancouver, was bankrupt, essentially, like a lot of local governments in Canada. And there'd been land for development that was forfeited to the municipal government because the developers were broke during the Depression and couldn't pay their taxes. Meanwhile, the Guinness family, which is actually an English family, even though they're known for their Irish stout and brewing expertise, came and saw this beautiful land on the North Shore that was available for a very low price to the municipal government. They put about $1 million in and bought what has become the British Pacific Properties. People in Vancouver often refer to it shorthand as the British Properties. I think there's even a bus route that says British Properties as its destination. So this was on the North Shore and had beautiful views and close to downtown, but not directly connected because there was a body of water, Burrard Inlet, between West Vancouver and the North Shore and the Central Business District in downtown. So what was needed was for these executives who would buy the homes in these British Pacific Properties from the global investment developers, what was needed was major mobility infrastructure to get those people not on a ferry boat, but directly in their automobile, which was the elite mode of transportation in that part of the 20th century, right to the Central Business District. And that's where this area that's circled was developed as an expressway, in the sense that you have 4.2 kilometers, I believe, of limited access road with no traffic lights, no crosswalks, no interruption for the high speed, relatively speaking, flow of motor vehicle traffic, so those executives can get to and from their offices quickly. What stands between West Vancouver and the North Shore and the crossing at the First Narrows, which we'll get to in a minute, and downtown Vancouver, of course, as I said, is the cathedral of green urbanism here in our region, Stanley Park. But that was not allowed to stand in the way of progress and global investment, because once the British Pacific Properties investors agreed or put forward the proposal that they would pay for a bridge, a road bridge crossing Burrard Inlet at the First Narrows, the city of Vancouver during the depths of the Depression could not resist the temptation of chopping down a huge swath of Stanley Park, as you can see in these pictures, to connect up to this bridge that was under construction. So if anyone ever asks you where the first urban expressway in Canada was and what they had to do to build it, now you know that we desecrated our temple of green sustainability at the time in Stanley Park, and we still have this, it has a nice euphemism, it's hiding in plain sight today. It's called the Stanley Park Causeway, which sounds very innocuous, but by definition of Transportation Association of Canada, it is an urban expressway, and it happened before. I mean, there'd been highways built in Canada outside of cities, but this was the first one that was built inside a city, and in particular, inside its nicest public park. Would this infrastructure have been developed without the global direct investment in the bridge and the real estate in West Vancouver? That's one of those great questions that urbanists can spend their time thinking about. And that's why I think it's important to study global city dynamics, because I believe that it did reshape Vancouver's transportation priorities in the 1930s to do this. I don't think that we would have an expressway running through Stanley Park if there wouldn't have been private investment to build this bridge to the North Shore to access the land development that the Guinness interests had purchased. Well, by the 1960s in Vancouver, sticking with expressways and global capital's influence on transportation priorities, there were plans, as this illustration of a future that never happened suggests, to build a big modern central business district that looks, to my view, quite a lot like Place Ville-Marie. If you look at the third building from the right, it looks a lot like Place Ville-Marie, right along the waterfront in downtown Vancouver. This was, again, mainly British investment capital that had been organized to build the complex. There's only one building, Granville Square, that was actually completed in this project. But of course, to build all these office towers and have a corporate executive modernist center, just like Place Ville-Marie on the waterfront in Vancouver, you needed mobility infrastructure, which is illustrated in the foreground of this painting, a nice waterfront expressway, which was all the vogue in the 1960s in many cities around the world. And here you see what didn't happen, but what would have been necessary to fill in the green square. It's my crude, clumsy way to illustrate the central business district in Vancouver. The existing expressways that were already there, specifically for the southern and eastern suburbs, the Trans-Canada Highway all the way on the right, which went across at the second Narrows to the North Shore, needed some way to get people into downtown. So the plan for this grand, modern, office-centered view of downtown Vancouver was to connect an expressway that would have cut through East Vancouver, Strathcona, Chinatown, Gastown, and run right along the waterfront, as that picture illustrated. But by 1960, when the early 60s, when these plans were being proposed, public financing of urban expressways had really developed. In the 1930s, that was in its infancy, and the idea that you could get private capital to build a bridge and then have the city chop down the park to connect it up with an expressway, that was all very innovative and improvised, if you will. But by the 1960s, governments, especially in the United States, but also increasingly in some European cities, were getting into the infrastructure efforts to build expressways in their cities for economic and supposedly social development. And private investors were no longer expected anywhere else in the world to pay for the urban expressway infrastructure. And they certainly were not interested in paying for it here in Vancouver. There's a phrase in the United States that I took to illustrate this that is often found whenever you come across highway or expressway roadworks. They put up a big sign that says, "Your tax dollars at work." So by the 1960s, this norm of public finance, often which happened through national transportation programs and also state level subnational transportation programs, was well established, but not in Canada. In Canada in the 1960s, and certainly in British Columbia, we could talk about other places maybe later, but for this talk, in British Columbia, there were big public provincial investments in infrastructure spending, but most of it, in fact, almost all of it, was happening outside of cities. There was a roads to resources program, beautiful highways being built, as you can see, in northern British Columbia to get logs and minerals and other things exported to global markets. That seemed like a great idea, and not to mention the hydroelectric dams that were built during that time. So the province had an infrastructure agenda, just not an urban infrastructure agenda. And at the local level, where there was a lot of opposition to the impacts of urban expressways, which was almost a universal phenomenon in the 1960s. It happened in Montreal and Toronto as well. There were lots of protests, there were riots, which had big impacts on local government here in Vancouver, which we could again talk about later. The city council changed after the famous Gastown riot, which occurred when the police tried to evict squatters and people who'd been hippies who'd been living on abandoned or semi-used spaces in Gastown. So there was a lot of local protest, and the provincial government did not get a lot of support politically from the cities at the time, or from Vancouver in particular, which did not incline the social credit government of the day to want to invest a lot of money in urban infrastructure. So the real reason that Vancouver wound up without more urban expressways, it was an early adopter, as I said, in the 1930s, but not much afterwards, was this combination of lack of finance during the apogee of happy motoring, when cars were seen to be universally good and worth bringing everywhere across North America, and the local opposition, of course, to that as well. But there was just as much local opposition to expressways in Montreal and Toronto, and the results were different because more capital had been assembled, including leveraging global opportunities. That didn't happen in Vancouver, so we wound up being very righteous later, saying we knew what we were doing and it was all part of the plan. But in reality, I think we were lucky that our provincial government did not see the hairy and noisy hippies of Vancouver as a community worth investing in. So they didn't give any money to build these expressways, and the private developers also weren't prepared to put money in. So that grand scheme for the Place Ville-Marie never happened. The urban expressway didn't happen. And it was time for developers, other interests, political leaders to regroup and think, well, what should we do now to make Vancouver a place that people want to come to and get to know, and know that we're open for business, so to speak. Well, by the 1980s, that plan coalesced into Expo 86. That global mega event was going to be and turned out to be Vancouver's entry, coming out party, whatever you want to call it, for global investment as a place to be. And if this sounds familiar, we were copying or borrowing, depending how you want to call it, same policy strategy that had been developed in Montreal in the 1960s and 1970s. Montreal had an expo in 1967, and Montreal had an Olympics in 1976. And those were used to leverage mega projects, more expressways, but also metro development. By the time Vancouver opened this recipe book and copied the recipe, we had an expo in 86 and an Olympics in 2010. And by that time, at least in the urban space of Vancouver, expressways were off the menu. They were not going to be considered. So the mega events were linked to mega infrastructure projects, particularly rapid transit. Excuse me, I jumped ahead. So the Olympics brought us the Canada Line, which connected us up to the airport, Canada's first major city to have an airport rail link. If I emigrated to Canada in 1984, just before the expo, but I was in Toronto. If you would have asked me to take a bet in 1984, which city in Canada would have the first rail link to its airport, I would not have bet on Vancouver. I would have almost certainly thought that it would have been Toronto or Montreal, but we were the first. And it has a lot to do with the global pursuit of this mega event known as the Olympics. So we've been building rapid transit lines slowly but surely since the Expo line, which tells you exactly how that came into being. It's right in the name. In 1986, we built the Expo line in the 1980s, the Millennium line, which is the gold one on the map there. In the 1990s, it opened at the end of that decade. We built the Canada line in the 2000s for the 2010 Olympics. For the 2010s, we built an extension that's not pictured here into the northeast up in Coquitlam. So we built about one rapid transit line per decade, and virtually no urban expressways after the midpoint of the 20th century. But we built a lot of expressways in the metropolitan region outside the city spaces. There you see a picture on the right of the famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, Port Mann Bridge, which is the second biggest urban highway bridge in North America. The biggest one is the Bay Bridge, Oakland Bay Bridge replacement in San Francisco for a region that is quite a bit bigger. So we've built a lot of that infrastructure. But of course, the Vancouver story of the results of not building more expressways and putting our global strategies and aspirations into rapid transit, the SkyTrain and metro system, has allowed for, some might say caused, but certainly been correlated with an extraordinary capital accumulation that would not have worked if the infrastructure of the 1960s, here's a sketch of what on the lower right, what an expressway interchange just east and north of downtown Vancouver, sort of in the space now that has become the Concord Pacific development area, around where the big stadiums and casino are. It would have all been a big expressway interchange, and that would not have enabled the Vancouverism that we now celebrate, but also worry about the social inequalities of. So that's what happened here when we were able to create spaces for human scale mobility more than automobility. And then the development patterns worked to attract a lot of capital, global capital, into that space. And so, like a lot of similar patterns in Montreal and Toronto, similar but not identical, Vancouver has turned into this duality at the metropolitan scale, a phrase that was first uttered in Toronto when I was in graduate school in the 1980s by the chief planner for at the time, the Toronto Transit Commission, Yuri Pill, said that Toronto was turning into Vienna surrounded by Phoenix. And I think there are elements of that in all of the major cities in Canada, but certainly in Vancouver, we have the Vienna part, the downtown core, where auto ownership has been growing less quickly than the human population. In other words, people are moving into the city and leaving their cars behind. But in the suburban areas, particularly south of the Fraser River, where there has been the expressway-oriented suburban development, we have Phoenix. And when this was first observed, it was said without irony and without sarcasm. In a sense, it was seen to be an achievement of sorts that, Canada, this is the ambivalent urbanism that I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, that Canada had been able to have its cake and eat it too. We'd created something for everyone. Our urban spaces, if you wanted suburbs, you could go to the Phoenix part. And if you wanted urban living, like in Europe, you could go to the Vienna part, and we'd solve the urban enigma. That was a nice feeling for the 1980s when I lived in Toronto, to think that we'd solved the urban challenges between space and place. But it turned out to be transitory. In some ways, Phoenix has taken its revenge on Vienna, and pollution, other social issues, congestion have grown steadily in the Greater Toronto area and also outside of the core of Vancouver. And that raises the question, if we're going to think of this not ironically, but sort of in terms of future sustainability, what would it require if you actually did develop an urban region to be both Vienna and Phoenix? What kind of mobility infrastructure would you need to get people connected in Phoenix and Vienna? And what it actually suggests to me is that you need both. You need both the rapid transit and the expressway infrastructure, which is a very expensive solution to city making, to have to build both out in both parts of the region. It's maybe something that is beyond the scope and the affordability of even the global capital and development interests that want to keep growing and expanding these areas. So we may need some retrofitting, and I think it won't surprise you that I would like to see more Vienna and less Phoenix in Canada's urban future. But that's another story. Let's just take stock in conclusion of Vancouver's experience with its big moves, and how that, I think, is echoed, or we can maybe discuss later how it's been echoed across Canada. So what we've seen since the 1930s in Vancouver is that global city dynamics, whether it's international capital going into a bridge and real estate development, or whether it's global mega events like expos and Olympics, those have catalyzed both public and private investment to develop the major mobility infrastructure. And in particular, in both Vancouver and Montreal's case, these mega events are very helpful for accelerating mega projects and making sure they happen on time, because not necessarily on budget, although sometimes that happened. It happened in Vancouver more than in Montreal. Once the world is coming and the event happens on a specific date, you have to get that work done in time. So that was another lesson from the experience here, and it worked both for the 86 and the 2010 mega events. And finally, equivocation, mixing and trying to create something for everyone, the Vienna and the Phoenix mobility. That can be politically expedient, and it certainly worked for local, regional, and provincial governments who are trying to win support and influence people in both the cities and the suburbs. But it does, as I've suggested, defer or put off the increasing economic costs of how do you make mobility work across an urban region that is both like Vienna and Phoenix at the same time. And those issues eventually can't be avoided. So that is kind of where big moves leaves off and sets the stage maybe for future analysis and research as to how we will reconcile the mobility legacies that have emerged, such as I've discussed here for Vancouver. So I will stop there and look forward to discussion.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Yes, so thank you. It is time for discussion, and I hope that we will have a chance to discuss some of the provocative comparisons that you did actually make with Montreal, even though this was mostly a story about the Vancouver element of your research. Who would like to either raise your hand, or in fact, we're a small enough group that if you'd like to unmute yourself and simply ask your question, that's also fine. But I'm happy to take a list if you'd like to raise your hand.
Je me lance. Merci beaucoup.
I will go ahead. Okay. Well, thank you, Anthony, for that very nice presentation. It was very interesting, and effectively the comparison elements could be provocative, but it's a very rich one to actually read the history of the infrastructure like you did for between Vancouver and Montreal. My question is not on the comparison, but in Montreal, Vancouver has a very positive image for sustainable development as being, in fact, an example, and especially in the matter of mobility, we had historical understanding of the question I'm asking actually, what are the social issues or social equities in the sustainable transportation mode? Is that a problematic that is specific to Vancouver? Is there any, do you know to what kind of or what type of population these infrastructure were beneficial, these fast transportation infrastructure, which are servicing essentially the center of the agglomeration?
Questions. I think, as I suggested, I think that depending who you ask, the metaphor of Vienna surrounded by Phoenix is one that some people think is a solution and others think is a problem. Some people still would, the element of equivocation and ambivalence about that I think is constant in Canadian urbanism is that some people feel we should live and let live, and let the people who want to drive move to the suburbs and have their space and maybe fewer germs in the pandemic. Although, interestingly enough to me, the highest rates of infection in British Columbia are found in the south of the Fraser suburban areas that have more space per person on average, but also have greater inequality. It turns out that urban inequality is growing in the suburbs of Vancouver, and that mobility challenges of auto dependence exaggerate or increase that challenge. But in the, not to leave a sense that all is well in Vienna. In the Vienna part, the affordability of the housing due to the global investment and capital that has poured in, at least until the pandemic began, has made the housing unaffordable. So in the suburbs, you have more affordable housing and unaffordable mobility options. And in the city, you have less affordable housing and more affordable mobility. That is, to me, the 21st century challenge, the défi that Canadian urbanism will have to solve in each of our major regions, because it's reproduced or reflected in its own way in Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. I saw a question on the chat, from Tanya Paz. Yuri Pill, P-I-L-L. He was the chief transit planner when I was in grad school at the Toronto Transit Commission. He wound up having a career at one of the big investment companies that I can't remember right now. Certainly he went to where the money was, and global investment, urban investment capital. But Yuri Pill, P-I-L-L, and we have the quote referenced in Big Moves too. And as I said, it was presented as being not ironic, but as a form of urban achievement initially, to be able to have Vienna surrounded by Phoenix.
Anthony, do you see that Tanya's asked another question in the chat?
Let's see. Yes. About dealing with the Phoenix problems of building these large pieces of infrastructure. Yeah, well, the type of development that comes around expressway infrastructure is inevitably different and, in my view, much less sustainable than the type of infrastructure that can be, the type of development that can be coordinated and facilitated by public transport, whether it's rapid transit or even other forms, and active transportation. What we should be debating, I guess, in Canada, in my view, is to make sure that the money that now is promised and being spent actually from senior levels of government, including the federal government, in urban reinvestments in the last decade, maybe even a little bit less, and certainly going forward, there are plans and proposals and commitments to have very large regular investments in infrastructure coming from Ottawa to urban mobility. And we have to make sure that that infrastructure produces the most socially and environmentally sustainable development patterns and outcomes that are possible. And I don't know that we have the metrics and the organizational structures in place to guarantee that. And if the lessons of Big Moves are still operative, we have to guard against the Canadian urban ambivalence and the tendency when one group or another, maybe this time it will be the used car salesman, salespeople, or suburban developer types, say they're left out of this new sustainable mobility future. We have to guard against the political tendency to give them a piece of the pie, because we've gone too far, I think, already in terms of developing incompatible urban mobility infrastructures as a result of that equivocation and urban ambivalence, and it's not affordable or sustainable to keep doing that.
Sophie.
Bonjour, merci beaucoup pour la présentation. Ça fait bizarre de répondre en
Hi,
français.
and thank you for the presentation. Indeed, you do confirm that you had the translation, so I'm answering in French. Unfortunately, I missed the beginning. I'm sorry, but I think it was very useful to, in fact, tell us about this global dynamic development. And I have actually taken good note, and I examined this case also in my thesis. I tried to apply it to Montreal. Would like to have a kind of a question reaction. You're asking us if we here in the country having the capacity and the institutional infrastructure to take the good decision in matter of transportation. Florence and I are really involved in the actual debate because in Montreal we have a debate and it affects the major collective transportation infrastructure, but which are having the same modus operandi of building the highways that were crisscrossing the city. We had this the REM project. Florence can talk about more than I, but they really get into the city like a bully, and they do not even bother with urban planning and urban transportation planning. So I was asking myself, there was other parallels to be made elsewhere. You know, this dependency, because the dependency to path dependency, the way that we do build the major infrastructure, like they did for the highways. They build a major infrastructure which is totally, coming from top down, and really, it's really, it's really a situation of being path dependent, and it's aberrant as the lack of maturity that you, in fact, notice the same pattern from one era to the other. So is there some parallel to be done with other cities in the world? Because I'm worried about it, and you said it yourself, it's clearly something important. Infrastructure will leave traces over the long run. So when we are even building new collective or mass transit infrastructure, how can it affect the urban development? It's very important in terms of climate changes, and it's really present in our public debates, but not that much. So I would like to hear you, or even Florence, you want to say something? Well, I would like to add something because I had to leave, but we are three of path dependency, which is very, very elevated with the RAM project. Just like a highway, while we just reformed the regional governance for transportation and for territory organization, so we're doing reform, trying to break down the path dependency and the dependency to financing and decision taken at a higher level of government. And this actually will show us that there is a continuity in dependency. So it would be very interesting to have comparison cases of bad practices.
When it comes to transport infrastructure policy and development, the way it works is the golden rule, and it was so he used male gender terms. He said the golden rule is he who has the gold makes the rules. So when it comes to transport finance, the levels of government, the organizations that provide the money are the ones so far who have been able to set the terms of the development, the planning, and the integration or not with local land use and community development. The interesting thing about Canadian urbanism is that because we did not have a national yet, maybe this will evolve, but because we did not have a national urban ministry or a national transportation program and policy for cities anyway, we had other gateway programs and things that were national in scope, but because we didn't have those for the urban space, each project is a made-to-measure construction organizationally as well as physically. If you go to the United States, or I would imagine to France or Germany, where they have national programs and structures in place, the technology, the types of planning, the land use mobility relationship is somewhat more consistent, because people don't start from zero each time they have a project to create and invent this kind of structure, using the golden rule often, but still each one is different. That is why Montreal has a rubber-tired metro, and Vancouver picked a made in Canada unique SkyTrain technology, and the original metro in Toronto was built in England from a UK source. Each project, each program sort of developed its own priorities and its own approaches to how to do that urban mobility. The good news, I guess, is that if we didn't get it right, it should be, or as right, it should be easier to adapt by this kind of project-specific creation. And maybe the federal character of Canada will lead to one region or one urban region doing something sufficiently impressive with this type of new reinvestment in urban mobility that's happening with REM in Montreal, and with expansion of the SkyTrain here and various other projects in the Greater Toronto area. Maybe once it is clear that one approach and strategy is producing significantly better results, then the others will adapt and learn from that. We might be able to benefit, in other words, from policy learning within the diversity of approaches that still exist in Canada.
J'espère que vous apprendrez pas de nos erreurs à Montréal.
I hope that you won't have to learn from our mistakes in Montreal.
Urban park to build an expressway, since Vancouver did it in the 1930s. So I hope people in other parts of Canada learn something from our approach to urban expressway leadership in Canada at that time. We can all learn from each other's mistakes.
And also, one of the things I just wanted to return briefly to the remark that you've made about the suburb versus the urban dichotomy, and I wonder how these new programs are going to evolve in a context of a blurring of the boundaries between what constitutes a suburban form, built form, and what constitutes an urban form in the Canadian context. It seems to me that that's one place where Vancouver has differed from Toronto and Montreal, but maybe will not. We'll stop differing so much as development takes off in the suburbs of Montreal and Toronto, perhaps. I don't know if you have any final thoughts on that kind of changing dynamic.
Well, we ended the Big Moves book by saying it's time to figure out whether our urban ambivalence will evolve or extend or expand into the canaburbs, the sort of Canadian approach to suburbs, which again are somewhat different than the American counterparts. The Phoenix around Toronto actually technically is more dense and more diverse, certainly socially, but even economically, than the Phoenix around Phoenix. That metaphor takes you so far, but not all the way. Like any metaphor, it's got its limitations. And so our concluding thoughts in the book are that Canadian suburbs will evolve, or have already evolved, to a less suburban auto dependence than their US counterparts, for example, and could evolve even further in that direction. But it's going to take some some good planning and good infrastructure choices, and maybe a little bit less equivocation in the sense of building an extra bridge or expressway just to satisfy a few developers or local boosters in those suburbs. But we shall see how that evolves.
Thanks very much. Our hour together is coming to an end. I wanted to see if there are any final comments that anybody wanted to share, and then I'll pass the mic over to Valérie, who had just wanted to remind us of our upcoming events. Any final comments or thoughts?
Est-ce que je peux poser mais en commentaire? Oui.
Can I answer this question as a comment? Well, I would like to say a few words about the urbanization in Vietnam, where the major metropolis and the medium city are doing exactly the same thing as Vancouver did in the 1930s. Fortunately, actually, they are more opting for light rail, and but I would say that it is a global phenomenon. The fact that they will cut the cities with something that will left traces for decades. Well, that's it. Thank you. I would like to take the opportunity of the last minute to tell you that next conference will happen this Monday, Monday 22nd. Hélène Bélanger, she's a professor at the UQAM, Université du Québec à Montréal, access to housing and social housing, and the conference after the other conference, the fourth one, will be held on March 26th. That's also next week, but Friday. And this time it will be Sophie Van Ness, that is water, and Florence Poliak and Marie-Soleil Cloutier on sustainable mobility. So if you want to register, please write to me if you want to receive the Zoom link for the conference. Thank you, Mr. Perl. Thank you, Meg. Okay.
Thank you very much, Valérie. Thank you, Pierre, for the translation. Thanks very much, Anthony, for all of the fascinating content. And let's hope that together we can hold our urban aspirations to account across Canada. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
À bientôt.
À bientôt.
See you soon. See you soon.